What is love? Where does it come from? And what is it for? If you think you've got that figured out already, then I suggest you read the story that we're going to be covering in today's episode. It's called The Sanctimonious Cobbler, and it's by Wang Anyi, who has cropped up once before on this show. We looked at one of her short stories from the anthology The Book of Shanghai, but now Wang Anyi is getting her own episode. Also returning, in a sense, to the podcast is my guest for this episode, Lehyla Heward. She's coming on to talk. She in fact chose this story. That's why we're talking about it. So you'll have that to look forward to. But first, we have the TrChFic news, the translated Chinese fiction news. So we have 4 news items today. I'll try and shoot through them, but we'll see how that goes. So the first one is a newsletter that you can sign yourselves up to. I don't know how new this newsletter is, but I newly heard about it. So it's called the ARC-E newsletter. It's run by someone called Louise Law, and it provides updates on Hong Kong literature and its publication, translation, promotion abroad. That's it basically. So if you're interested, there's a link to that in the show notes. Next news item. Again, this is something that is not new per se, but it's newly joined Twitter. It's Durham University's Centre for Contemporary Chinese Studies. They picked perhaps a slightly odd time to join Twitter. I hope they've opened up an account on a Twitter parallel, or at least have some kind of contingency plan for the downfall of Twitter, but I guess we'll see. That's all for our second news item. Just a short one. Our third news item, this one is pretty cool. I'm quite happy about this one. A former Lushun haunt has been restored to its former glory. So if you've ever been around the sort of Lushunified area of Shanghai's Hongkou district, where he and various other leftists, revolutionary, forward-thinking, modern, blah 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 blah, progressive writers of his time lived and wrote and chatted and gathered, it's in that sort of area. When I was living in Shanghai, it was a Xinhua bookstore, and it did apparently have a little mini museum about this original Uchiyama bookstore inside, but it's now been restored. So if you're thinking Uchiyama doesn't sound very Chinese, and in fact sounds Japanese, you're right. It was run by a Japanese guy living in Shanghai at the time. Hongkou was the sort of Japanese run area. I don't know if it was referred to as a concession, but essentially it was sort of a Japanese parallel to the like the French concession and the Anglo-American concession. And yeah, it's been re-Uchiyamified. I've linked to 3 places where you can see some pictures of it and read some info about it. There's the Twitter account of Tingguo Rights, and then there's 2 actually state media outlets have published news about this, China Plus and Shine. So yeah, it's interesting, you know. Presumably, the government must have had some look in on this, because Xinhua is a state-owned company, and Xinhua has, it seems, seeded this bookstore to be sort of Japanified in a way, although of course it does have the leftist cred of Lushun, or the sort of genealogical May 4th to CCP pipeline cred there as well. So yeah, an interesting one. If you're in Shanghai, please do visit. Please do send photos of it over. That would be amazing. Okay, final news item. This is an announcement of a planned pair of publications. So the first is, well, actually, they're both from the same publisher. They're both from Two Lines Press. So Two Lines Press has announced they're going to be publishing a translation of Xu Zhicheng's Beijing Sprawl, and a reissue with a nice new cover that matches Beijing Sprawl of their Running Through Beijing, also by Xu Zhicheng. I know that Running Through Beijing was a Eric Abrahamson translation. I'm not sure if Beijing Sprawl will be the same. I'm just opening up the tweet right now. No, this one is a joint. So this new one will be a joint translation by Jeremy Tiang and Eric Abrahamson. That's pretty cool. So well done to both of you for bringing out more Xu Zhicheng into the English language bookshelf. That's marvelous. That is all our news items, so I will cease my solo ramblings, and you'll get to listen to me chatting to Lehyla about Wang Anyi's novella, and we'll indeed be talking about what even is a novella. So enjoy. So on the show, we have a returning friend of the pod, Lehyla Heward. Fantastic to have you back, Lehyla. What have you been up to since last time when you came on to talk about, let me see, Radish by Moyan? What's happened since then?
it's very good to be back. I'm happy to be doing this again. And I kind of can't believe that it's already been almost 3 years since we last recorded, which is crazy.
Ouch.
And a lot has happened. When we recorded, I had just finished my PhD, and this was like March of 2020. So it was right before everything went down. In fact, I think we even talked about how there was a virus happening, but like no lockdowns had happened outside of China at that point. And
Shit.
now we're in a situation where the only lockdowns happening are in China again. So it's like a weird turn of events in that way. But right after we spoke last time, literally days, I was on a plane to Taiwan, escaping New Zealand's first 48 hour, no, first, I was 48 hours away from their first month-long lockdown. Got to Taiwan and actually had to like sleep in my friend's car because you couldn't just like get into a hotel room without going through quarantine. So I had a whole thing in Taiwan. I ended up being there for about 6 months, but then I got hired at the University of Malta to be a lecturer in Chinese studies. So then hopped over here to Malta in September 2020, and I've been here since then, learning how to be a lecturer.
That's just mental. I actually did not listen to our previous episode together as prep for this one, so I'd totally forgotten the where that one landed, re coronavirus. But I have re-listened to one or two from, well, I guess it's quite a large window of time, really, the pandemic. But all of those points in the conversation are very interesting little time capsules.
Definitely. I didn't re-listen to that one too, but it's funny that you say time capsule because I have this memory of you saying that at the time.
Ugh, creepy. So your place in the world has changed pretty dramatically, like you said. You're still working in and around Chinese literature. So
Yes.
how, if at all, has your appreciation of or relationship with Chinese literature shifted since then? So like I've read a lot more and I've talked a lot more about it, but how about you?
Same. I think teaching has given me an opportunity to really dig into certain authors' works and even theories or critical discussions that I hadn't fully like engaged with before. I would say I had a deeper than cursory knowledge in that I had to do a master's and a PhD about these things, but there were things that I had still sort of missed out on, especially in terms of Chinese literary thought. And so I would say a lot of what my teaching focus has centered on in the last couple of years is me trying to put into words that sort of like critical tradition in Chinese literature. And then trying to convey it to students who barely have a knowledge or barely have a working knowledge of the history of China and also, well, the more recent history of China, as well as a good grasp of Chinese literature. Like trying to do all of those at one time has been the challenge. But I would say, yeah, it's shifted in the sense that it's deepened. I've been able to read more, think more, and talk more about these things.
That's great. Do you have any personal favorite theorists or stories that have caught your eye since then?
I don't know if I would characterize it as favorite, but one of the things, the pieces that I've read recently, just to help myself, I'm gonna
Listeners, Lehyla is reaching off
I mean, it's already a little old. It was published in the 90s, but it's the introduction written by Kirk Denton in Modern Chinese Literary Thought.
Lehyla is pulling up an academic looking book.
Yes, it's a very academic book. Well, it is, but it isn't. It's actually full of translations of essays and thought pieces by people like Lu Xun and Guo Moro and Zhang Zhouwen and people like that. So it's full of translations, but it helps to have Denton's. He lays out these certain ideas. One, how early modern Chinese literary critics were engaging with Western literary thought, but then also how he's trying to teach us as readers how best to understand it. And that's really helped me a lot. And I think that it's helped my students, hopefully. We'll see. But I would say that's been on my mind heavily in the last few months.
For listeners who missed it, and for myself, what was the name of the book again?
Modern Chinese Literary Thought.
Okay.
Writings on Literature, 1893 to 1945, published in 1996.
Okay, that'll be in the show notes, listeners, in the episode description if you want to investigate that a bit more. I guess I should keep us marching forward onto our actual topic for this episode, which is a novella, The Sanctimonious Cobbler by Wang Anyi. Pretty exciting to be doing a novella.
Yes.
And it might be interesting to talk about the book that this novella sits inside, at least in English translation. That's interesting as well. In fact, I don't think I set aside a point to do that. So maybe I'll just quickly do that now. If listeners want to read this, it's inside a slightly hard to get book called By the River. Let me just look up the full title. By the River, 7 Contemporary Chinese Novellas, and it's published by Chinese Literature Today, which I believe is a journal under Oklahoma University, which I believe is the one that has sort of ties with Howard Goldblatt, the translator.
University of Oklahoma.
Yep, University of Oklahoma. So they have a journal that will have translations and essays, and they do have series of books. A recent one of theirs I read was Mo Yan's, funnily enough, Mo Yan's Sandalwood Death. That's a CLT book. So this one I believe you can get physical copies and possibly e-copies online, but I can secretly confide it's also up on archive.org. Won't show up in Google search results, interestingly, but you can sort of digitally borrow it through that virtual library there. And this novella is inside that book. There you go. There's the publication explanation. Next thing would be to sort of introduce and summarize the story. Quite a lot happens, nothing of really epic consequence. So I'll confess, I don't really have the intricacies of the plot memorized. I do have it in me to introduce the characters. So if you want to share responsibilities here, Lehyla, how about I'll introduce the characters? And if you're feeling up to it, you could try and run through the basics of the plot.
Giving away or not giving away the major spoiler?
There's a question. What would you rather do?
I feel like it is central to the plot at the end of the day. If there is a plot as such, it's kind of central. So I'm going to give it away.
Okay, right. So spoiler warning. If you don't want to know where this one goes, then go read it, then come back and listen to this episode, which is something I never do when podcasters tell me to do it. I just charge ahead every time.
Through.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I would characterize it as a story set in a Shanghai longtang, centering around a few early middle-aged or about middle-aged men and women, and their kind of daily lives in a big way. But I would say that they're all sort of in transition. So it touches on their transitions into the next phase of their lives. And it centers on 2 characters, the cobbler, obviously, that the story is named after, and one of the women in the longtang named Gundi. They end up having an extramarital affair briefly, but that ends up being kind of the culminating feature of the story and what sort of drives the plot, really.
Yep. And alongside the cobbler and Gundi, there's Xiaodi, Gundi's husband. There's another woman, Jinrong, and there's Uncle Ye, who's pretty memorable. And I'll make a confession here. My reading of the story was initially a little muddled because I thought Uncle Ye was another name for the cobbler, because we don't learn the cobbler's name for a while. And then eventually I realized, wait, this Uncle Ye seems to have a totally different personality from the cobbler. They're like opposites almost.
Almost, yeah. They're really quite different.
Yeah. So it's worth probably going into the personality and the background of all of them. The cobbler is this very sort of kind of morally upright and elevated character at the start of the book. He's salt of the earth, working man, but also reads Song dynasty literature in his spare time. and is very restrained. Like he has lots of female customers, women, whatever. His customers are mostly women, and they are always trying to flirt with him. And he's just sort of, he doesn't rebuke them nastily, but he also he behaves completely appropriately for a married man. So he's this real paragon of virtue, but obviously that becomes muddied.
And
I
he
guess
speaks in, what's the word for it?
Aphorisms?
Yes, he speaks in aphorisms.
Yeah.
That's another kind of quirk about him.
Right. So he's got a lot of insight. He's well respected. But a more human side comes out towards the end of the story. So that's him.
But I think it's worth mentioning that he is married,
yes,
but he's from a village, and his wife and family is all in the village, and he's alone in the city.
Yeah, it's a village. I think it's in the northern reaches of Shanghai, the Shanghai municipality. So I'll bring that up again because that ties him to another character. His opposite in the story, I hadn't really thought about this before, but now that I mention it, he's more or less got an opposite in the character of Uncle Ye, who is this now the cobbler is a younger guy, if I'm remembering
younger.
right.
I think
Slightly.
He's in his early 30s. Yeah,
right. Uncle Ye is like, he's early middle-aged like the majority of the cast, and he plays mahjong. He's doesn't have much of a filter. He's
a bit of a flirt, just a little bit.
Yeah, bit of a cad a cad. I think that's a good word for him. Not an evil character, but not a moral paragon either. And then we have the two female characters who are kind of mirror images of each other in a way.
Also, yeah, definitely.
Because one is presents as more sort of, I guess, middle class and upright, and Jinrong, yeah. And then Gundi is much more free and easy in the way she communicates and behaves, and has a sort of this. I think her family are from the same sort of area as the cobbler, the northern reaches of Shanghai. They're so far north in the Shanghai municipality that they think of themselves as Jiangsu people, basically. For any listeners who don't know, Jiangsu is the next province north of Shanghai. And it's definitely true. If you don't know your Shanghai geography, it does extend far enough that once you're at the edges of what's considered the border of Shanghai, it's not really urban anymore. It's more like villages. So they've got those sorts of more down-to-earth roots. Gosh, and then everyone ends up in some kind of a love rivalry with one another.
I think it's also worth mentioning that Jinrong is presented as very straight-faced, as in cold, not particularly beautiful, not ugly, but just more towards the plain side, only because she's cold, whereas Gundi is portrayed as very fashionable. There's a part where she's described as either dressing kind of Western or dressing very modern, depending on who is looking. And she's very beautiful, but it comes from that village life. So she's a bit, not very sophisticated, a bit unsophisticated. Yeah. And very warm, unlike Jinrong.
Yeah. And I think that it also talks about Jinrong's fashion style as well. She doesn't have a sort of modern trendy style, but she does wear, I guess, more sort of formal, very feminine clothes. I think it often describes her floating skirts and dresses and whatnot.
Yes.
Whereas Gundi, I don't think that's her style.
No. Yeah, she actually, Wang Anyi goes into a long description of Gundi's style, but I would have to go search for it.
Yeah, it's something she thought about, I guess. You get lots of...
I can really see them in my mind. Like, to me, they're so different.
Yeah, all these characters are pretty easy for me to visualize. Maybe partly because I lived in Shanghai, although I was not living in this sort of neighborhood, that's for sure. But if you're in Shanghai, you're brushing shoulders with all of the economic spectrum. The one guy I didn't mention is Xiao Di, Gundi's husband.
Right.
He's a match for what my Chinese friends would often describe me as a stereotypical Shanghai man, Shanghai husband, or just Shanghai man, like ruled by his mother, a mummy's boy, perfectly well behaved, but not really lacking in substance and strength.
Yeah. Yeah.
And yeah, so Gundi she has what would you say, a stable relationship, but not a very satisfying one.
I like how all of these characters' marriages are described, because in that they're all about middle-aged, they've all been married for around 10 to 15 years. And so we get a description of their early married life in connection to what we see now, where they're kind of in a more, they all got into their marriages for one reason or another. And as time passed, maybe those reasons just became a little bit less important, things like stability or kids or what have you. And now they're just kind of in these vague partnerships, living together, none of them have any real passion, so to speak of. I think Uncle Ye is a perfect example. And I actually wanted to mention his relationship a little bit because it's so interesting. He's sort of a house husband. He knows that his wife she's the one making the money. He's sort of out of a job, but she's running a business and doing that quite well. And I like how he's described. He recognizes that she's got a lot of power because of that. And so he doesn't want to get in her way. And so he's sort of like, he doesn't argue with her too much. He also doesn't hold it against her. He just recognizes, okay, this is our dynamic now, and I need to act accordingly. So I quite admire that about him.
Right. Is he the character who we're told was sort of a loser in the reform and opening up of the economy, where like he had some sort of some job that was, part of the state economy and guaranteed to, whether it was making money or losing money, was guaranteed to sort of stay as an iron rice bowl. But then there's a section in the story I remember where the market forms hit and it sinks loads of businesses, and it takes a while for a smaller number to spring back up. And yeah, there's losers and winners, but it seems like, especially initially, there's a lot more losers in their section of Shanghai. It was also
Gundi.
Right.
And I don't know, I can't remember Jinrong's situation, whether she had been working, or I think she is still working, but it's it's not very high paying. She doesn't own her own business, I think, if I remember right.
Yeah, but it's definitely a shopkeeper kind of story. I remember early in my first year in China, I was sharing an office with this very quiet American guy. He was actually a Mormon. And he gave me he wasn't the most useful guide for a new arrival in China, because he was not very forthcoming. But he did say something which at first I didn't quite get. Then it rang more and more true later. He said, if you want one way to understand China in general, is just think of it as a nation of shopkeepers. And on a basic level, the number of small shops is just crazy anywhere you go. But the sort of vibe, once you get to know what the vibe of the people working in those shops is, you do get, I think, the vibe of the street, at least in the towns and the cities.
Yeah, that's interesting that you say that, because I wanted to go back and look at the beginning of the story again. And the whole first chapter, or I don't know, the first few pages is devoted to just understanding how the cobbler moves from corner to corner due to different economic things that are going on. And when like the police come and say, oh, you can't stay on this corner, he moved just to that corner. He'll just go across the street. So it's interesting that you say that, because that's exactly how the story starts.
Yeah, I kind of went in thinking that's going to be what the whole thing is about, and not about sort of the drama of some people in their marriages or failing marriges or not. Because I'll read the first few lines, it makes you think it might be a slightly different sort of Shanghai story, and then you realize later it's just sort of setting the mood and the setting. It says, the first words are, in order to explain how this particular bit of turf ended up belonging to the young cobbler, it's probably a good idea to first look at the history of the city and its development in modern times, which practically speaking means certain people and certain events. Thank you, Wang Anyi. Originally, the patch of dirt in question had been on the edge of town, part of a larger tract where the city's foreign residents had located their cemetery, which locals called the foreign, oh, I've scrolled out and lost it, which locals called the foreign graveyard. The streets nearby were crowded with florists, candle shops, sellers of statuary, crosses, angels, Virgin Marys carved of wood or stone, and other objects suitable for placing on graves. Later on, a Chinese cemetery was established on the farmland adjoining the cemetery, and shops catering to Chinese funerary customs soon proliferated as well, selling things like incense, candles, paper effigies, burial robes, ghost money, and Chinese-style coffins. And then it goes on a bit more about sort of the transition away from Shanghai being a colonial city. And then it kind of makes sense, I suppose, that it talks about a transition from a fully socialist economy Shanghai to the marketified Shanghai that exists today.
Mm-hmm.
It also makes me wonder if we're supposed to infer this is happening around Jing'an, because I know Jing'an Park used to be a foreign graveyard.
Oh.
A fact, haunted Shanghai fact. Or it could potentially also be Jiāo'ào, because that was where there was a great big Catholic, French Catholic church, which is still there, but I believe that's all that was in old Shanghai, or it might be somewhere else entirely. But the Virgin Marys made me think maybe this is a French or some other Catholic corner.
That could make sense. Don't they mention the church in, I might be thinking of a different story that I read recently, but isn't there a mention of a church again somewhere else?
I've forgotten.
I think that might be a different story. Sorry.
I can say I might have gone into this in a past episode. I did have a really interesting, just one evening or one afternoon in Shanghai. I got invited by a friend from the first place I lived in China, Deqing in Zhejiang province. She had these friends in Shanghai. She was going to visit, and she brought me along, and they were sort of older, middle-aged people. And in their house, which was a very old school Shanghai dwelling, they had a little shrine which had Virgin Mary and some fruit and stuff, and some other Christian items, maybe like a cross, and a picture of an older man and an older woman, who I guess was one of this couple's parents. And I asked, like, are you guys Christians? Have you inherited whatever, that part of Shanghai's history? And they said, no, but my parents were, so we've given them the shrine they would have wanted to have, a sort of Catholic style one. I was like, damn, how many months and even years have I been here, and I'm only getting this little piece of Shanghai history is only reaching me now. Felt so much more real than a sort of beautified, well-preserved church or a museum. These are actual people living in the alleyway.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Just crazy.
Mm-hmm. I always had that feeling too when I would have taxi drivers, for example, who had a cross hanging from their from their mirror. I would always end up in a conversation about basically the same thing. Yeah.
Right. When I saw things like that, I assumed they might be a more recent convert, because there is that wave of Christians in the country as well. But did you find in Shanghai that they were more often like that it had deeper roots, or do you know?
Oh, my experiences weren't usually in Shanghai. They were
right.
where I was living in the north.
Yeah.
I usually got the sense that they weren't exactly recent converts, but I don't know. I don't think I ever had a full conversation about the lengths of it in their family. So
okay, right. Yeah. Interesting. We could go down this rabbit hole further. Is there anything else you want to talk about plot wise, or do we want to go on to Wang Anyi herself?
I think this is combining with what you're going towards with talking about her style in general. It's interesting. It's one of those stories where it starts out one way, you don't know exactly where it's going, because in terms of plot, it's very much like a winding alleyway in a lot of ways. You don't know exactly what next big road you're coming to.
Right.
I find that the issue of plot becomes something that is, like, from a teacher's perspective, it's so difficult when you read a story that really doesn't have a plot line. because students don't know what else to latch on to except for plot lines.
Right, yeah. I suppose it's just similar for stories in general. We may not be reading them for the actual story. We might be reading them for the vibe or for the ideas.
Right.
But if there is no story, then you're often stuck with the rather avant-garde, potentially kind of uninteresting piece of literature. Not always, but, we call them stories and not poems for a reason.
At the same time, I don't think that this type of story it's not unusual. In ages past, if you were sitting around listening, like I'll tell you, my grandpa used to have this story that he would tell us. It was more like a joke. There is no beginning and there is no end, but basically he would sit us around and he'd go, one dark and stormy night, many kids were sitting around the campfire, and I would poke the fire and begin. I don't know, there's a whole middle section, but he would call us out cousin by cousin, so basically from oldest to youngest, and it would go around in a circle like that. And it would just be so fun because you knew what was coming next, but you also didn't know exactly what was coming next. He would use his voice in different ways. He would make a few things up, and then suddenly insert so-and-so's name, and then they would poke the fire and begin, and then the story would start all over again. It was all very exciting, and it was meant to be done as a collective together activity. Like there was a lot of laughing and tickling and playing involved at the same time. That's not an unusual way of telling a story in days past, right? But for whatever reason, when it comes to exploring that type of storytelling in a classroom setting, students find it difficult sometimes.
Oh yeah, what I would maybe say is the thing that some people latch onto stories for would be more about the characters than plot. They say some stories are character driven rather than plot driven, but I would agree it's sometimes a bit harder if you're reaching for the deeper academic level ideas to analyze characters rather than say like the settings or the plot or the action. Unless you want to go into like sort of deep psychological analysis of the characters, which you could probably do for this one, but
Sure.
The story is so light that almost feels like betrayal if we start doing a Freudian analysis of Uncle Ye or something. Like it feels like the wrong approach.
What do you mean by light?
As in it's a story about ordinary, not very wealthy people, rather than Mao Zedong leading the armies on the Long March, or a Liu Cixin story about humankind trying to escape a doomed Earth or something. It's
not epic.
Yeah, this is a small scale story about real ordinary things.
I asked that question because I think I sort of felt that at first too, and then by the time I got to the end, I hate to admit this, I was actually very emotional by the end, and I think it's because the experiences that the two main characters go through, and actually all of them to an extent, we just don't really get to see how everything played out. Those might not be epic in the big historical national sense, but they're the type of experiences that change you as a person. And so they are very heavy at the end of the day. So that's why I asked, what did you mean by light?
Fair enough. I'll transition us into talking about Wang Yi herself. I was just screwing around in my ebook program, Caliber, trying to find the Book of Shanghai, because it was in my episode on that book that Wang Anyi came up in this podcast before. One of the stories from that book we talked about was her Afang's lamp. And the only real things I remember about that are it's about families or a family. They're shopkeepers and they're in Shanghai, and it's again very sort of small scale story, and it's emotionally touching. Is that typical Wang Anyi? Do you know, like, how familiar are you with her identity as an author?
I would say that's very typical, yes. When I first learned about her, this was back in like 2014 or so, what I knew about her was that she tended to write on domestic settings, very much centered or often centered on the women characters and what they might be going through. the stuff I've read around her, the critical pieces that I've read around her, tend to talk about her writing very autobiographical stories. Yes, that they touch on history, they touch on economics, they touch on the national story, but they almost always are centered on these day-to-day experiences and very, very human relationships.
Yeah, I've resorted to looking over on Wikipedia to get some quotes, people's takes and our own takes on her style. And there are a few good ones here. There's one from another show guest, Jeffrey Kinkley. He said that she's a realist whose stories are about everyday urban life and that she does not stint in describing the brutalizing density, the rude jostling, and the interminable and often futile waiting in line that accompany life in the Chinese big city.
Yeah.
And yeah, there's something about jostling that feels kind of right for the Sanctimonious Cobbler. People are in very close proximity to each other, and people things only blow up once really in the story, but there's a lot of sort of petty social maneuvering, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes. And I like how this is probably a note for a different question, but I also really like how that pettiness is told. The narrative of it is distanced and third person, and it's also a paraphrase of the past thing that happened and the reason why these people have an emotion towards each other, right? I think that's quite interesting as a technique. It reminded me a lot of Zhang Ailing, but I have read elsewhere, I can't remember where, that Wang Anyi doesn't really like to be compared to Zhang Ailing, which I can understand why. Although it's hard not to compare them in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of the Zhang Ailing Shang that I've read. It felt that the little that I have read felt a little more heightened. Heightened could mean lots of things. A little more experimental, maybe. The emotional situations are a little bit more fraught or politically, socially loaded, like in Lost Caution. Or there was one I did around episode 50. I forget what it was called, but it has like a sort of shifting between dream and reality. Sealed Off, that's what that was. Whereas the Wang Anyi I've read is much more sort of straightforward and socially realist. Like if I was thinking of Zhang Ailing Chang, I wouldn't think of a social realist because the sort of street level social conditions. I mean, she's concerned with maybe the everyday Shanghai, but it's more about the vibe of the city than like someone who has to have their, a cheap lunch cooked for them at the shoe shop every week or something. I'm hearing
you point to different maybe class orientations there.
Yeah. The Wang Anyi, like, little Wang Anyi I've read is like strictly working class, and the Zhang Ailing, it's a little bit more all over the place, but it seems like the people she finds most interesting tend to be either very rich or white collar.
Right. She was a product of her time, and
that's not a criticism, just a description, I think.
No, yeah, of course. That's what I think a lot of people still find fascinating about her. Definitely.
Yeah. I don't think I've got anything else very insightful to say about Wang Anyi. I remember you mentioned you wanted to mention a prize that she'd won.
Yes, she won the Newman Prize for Chinese Literature in 2017, which is also connected to the University of Oklahoma. That's where it sort of originated. I wanted to kind of touch on maybe something from her acceptance speech, I suppose, because that's a first person account for her, about what the prize means for her, or at least what her literature means for her. But then I guess it's also very important to note that the prize is based off of one work, and that work was her novel called Reality and Fiction, which was one of her earlier novels. I can't remember the date that it was originally published. But I like how she talks about it in her acceptance speech. because she talks about how she probably wouldn't be able to write that book nowadays. And it's because she's older and more experienced, whereas at that time she was trying to get out of her own head, and in the trying, she was trying to see what came out in this other space. So I quite find that interesting, that for her there's even an inability to go back to a former way of writing for her. So that's quite interesting. I'm trying to find a quote from the speech itself that I liked. So she says of this novel that she won the prize for, she says, "I took myself as a point of departure and traveled to a time and place where I was absent. There I built a paradise for that so-called absence of self, creating limitlessness out of limitation. Unlike Paleolithic humans, I did not have any physical tools in my hands, but I did wield a product of advanced civilization, the written word. In that respect, I consider myself indigenous to the age of civilization."
Holy moly.
Right? Those are big words. I really love that, though. I love that it uses the word indigenous. It really puts a different spin on, when we say like citizen of the world, for example, puts a different spin on just who we are as people who have language, and written language in particular. And I suppose in many ways it's very significant now that we're in 2022, getting into 2023, when a lot of people are talking about things like AI, and maybe like we live in a simulation or multiple simulations. We're thinking about existence in a really different way than we ever have before. So I just find it, to hear those words and know that you and me, and Wang Anyi, which rhymes, we're all indigenous to the age of civilization, and maybe there's a next point in time. You know what I mean? It feels like famous last words. That's what it feels like to hear that.
You mean a future where as individuals, we're not part of civilization?
Or, well, we maybe a few hundred years from now, there will be an indigenous to another kind of civilization. You know what I mean?
The feeling I got from her words there was just that I have a better idea of maybe why she was so good at writing characters who seem to be quite different from her, especially the men. Like in imagining herself in a place where she didn't exist was what she said, right? In so many words. She was
absent.
Yeah. So I mean, I don't know what sort of background she grew up in, but she created a very believable, like, to be honest, this is not the kind of story I'd read for fun, but I have to credit her for saying it was a very vivid, believable picture of this little neighborhood in Shanghai, and all the people seemed very well drawn. Like this sort of the cobbler, who's this morally upright guy who proves to be all too human, and yet I felt like it didn't really cheapen his moral or educational core there as well. And then like a character like Uncle Ye, I feel like she has a very clear view of a certain kind of guy, and the way his male desires drive him. I have to credit her for that, because obviously she's never been Uncle Ye, but she can understand Uncle Ye and write him and put him in his social context in that part of Shanghai at that particular time. And maybe it doesn't create something very flashy, but it creates something pretty impressive.
I would agree with that. Very fleshed out as a human, as a person.
My next, well, is there anything else you want to say about Wang Anyi? The only thing I really knew about her long ago is that she teaches at Fudan University, a Shanghai university. So Shanghai is her place, I guess. And also that she's the vice chair of the China Writers Association. So she's part of the system, very much so, which doesn't shock me, because to be part of the China Writers Association, which is a state-supported organization that gives approved writers a stipend and public publicity and so on, and status, to be part of that, you don't need to be a propagandist for the Communist Party, but you you can't write, you can't be a dissident, basically. You can't be too edgy and be in there. And I don't get the sense, although her writing is very socially focused, it doesn't seem to be, at least the stuff I've read is not socially critical, not directly anyway. So that's the only other thing I could really say. There's a whole Wikipedia page I should have read before it's got some really interesting info that, you know, when she was very little, the Cultural Revolution was going on and she was sent down to the countryside. But I'm not just going to sit here and read that now on the spot. That would be embarrassing for me.
What I find impressive about her is that I can't remember now where I read it, but somewhere it was mentioned that she kind of entered the literary scene quite early on, partly because her family, her mom at least, has a bit of a literary background as well. So when you talk about her being a part of the system, that wasn't unfamiliar to her even at a young age as a young writer. But this is the part where I don't know where I read it. I read somewhere that she, being in that association, sort of prompted her to feel like, okay, this is my work and I need to treat it as such. And so in a lot of ways, I see this as her taking discipline, a very, very disciplined approach to literature.
Right.
Which I really admire, just knowing that she's been writing since the 80s. She's prolific, but not in the sense that we often think of with like genius. She's prolific in the sense that it's just a constant output and it's of a high standard. In her nomination statement, or not her nomination statement, the scholar who nominated her, he is named, let me find it, Dai Jinhua. Actually, that might be a woman, I'm not sure. Dai
Jinhua. You keep talking, I will Google that name.
Right. The Professor Dai Jinhua is a professor at Beijing University.
Yeah, she's a lady.
She, excuse me, she wrote the nomination. She was the one who nominated Wang Anyi for the Newman Prize. And one of the things that she talks about is how Wang Anyi's works, they've all been quite different in the sense, like, she's experimental to a degree, at least. She has written different types of stories. Perhaps they could all be characterized in a more domestic sense, but at the same time, they're about really different materials, drawing from really different types of experiences. So I take the mind that she might not be critical, partly because she doesn't need to be critical. She is one of the people she's perhaps more focused on what literature can do and really putting her mind to developing a literary thought and multiple literary styles. I would consider her more of a writer in that sense than a public spokesperson.
For sure, yeah. And I think this was my thinking when I started the podcast, was that I found, I don't know, and it seems to be a popular idea in the English-speaking world that how good a Chinese writer is just about how critical they are of, China, right, essentially. And the thing I think is important to do is, on one hand, recognize that sort of writer is incredibly important under such an authoritarian government, but you should never go thinking that that's the sole criteria to measure the worthiness of an author, because
absolutely,
that's just silly and it's unkind to Chinese writers to make that your only criteria. Not a very original thought, but I don't think it can be said enough.
Right, I agree with that. And I suppose my wanting to bring up the idea of the Newman Prize it falls in that category a little bit, partly because what I know about the Newman Prize comes from my research on Moyan and how him receiving that prize, he was nominated for the Neustadt Prize, which is a prize for literature, but that happened before the Newman Prize. The Newman Prize was then created, and he, I believe, was the first person to receive it. And the Newman Prize, as its name is, it's specifically for Chinese literature, authors who are writing in Chinese and mainly from the mainland. He was nominated for that by Howard Goldblatt. And then just a few years later, was nominated for the Nobel Prize, also by Howard Goldblatt.
Yeah.
Right. And so there's this heritage. No, that's not the word I'm thinking of. There's like this behind the scenes things that are happening with these prizes that I don't think readers are often aware of. And what irked me when Moyen won the prize was that he was receiving so much criticism from scholars like Perry Link, and yet that, to me, one, it diminished his style, right? And two, it didn't take into account that the whole process that had happened to get him the Nobel Prize, which was the process of translating, the process of nominating, and just like the whole idea of what prizes are for in general, right? When it comes to Wang Anyi, she's not, what's amazing to me is she's not really receiving the type of criticism that Moyen received for the Nobel. But what if she were to win the Nobel? Would she also receive that criticism? So if we talk about what the prize is for and what really goes into it, maybe we'll be able to just like set that whole critique aside and be able to focus more on why the writing is impressive in the first place. Maybe. I don't know. To me, it's an interesting way to open that discussion. Let's say that.
Absolutely. Speaking of behind the scenes and Howard Goldblatt, listeners, here's an interesting window for you. I had some email communication with Mr. Goldblatt to see if he'd come on the show, but looks like no luck. I did get one reply, I haven't had a second. So, Howard, if you're listening, please reply to my email. Please come on. But I think realistically, it's not happening. It was close, but I don't think it's happening.
Fingers crossed.
Yeah, I had a look, by the way, on Wang Anyi's Wikipedia. Her family is insanely cultural. Her mother, Zhujuan, is a novelist, while her father, Wang Xiaopin, is a playwright and director. She has an elder sister, Wang Anwo, who is a former editor of a literary magazine, and a younger brother, Wang Anwei, who does literary art and research. And she's married to Li Zhang, who is an editor of Shanghai Music Publishing House. So
I think it's a credit to her to have grown up in such a family and not be outspoken of like how to change society, right?
Or to just write novels about writers.
Right.
Also, you can maybe guess what happened to her parents during the Cultural Revolution. They got sent to labor camps and she went down to the countryside. So yeah, there's the downside of having that sort of family at the wrong time in history. I
think that's kind of what I'm pointing to. She's a part of that same generation that became the new kind of cultural critics in the 80s. And some of her works in her early years, I do think kind of lean more towards that. But I think that it makes a lot of sense from a stylistic point of view that she became more interested in really really tightening the craft. That's what I admire about her.
Yeah, the Wikipedia also has a bit on like how she fits into that. There's different literary trends and movements. So it says her works have been studied as Zhiqing, educated youth. I don't know so much about that. Shungan, I do know about this. That's root-seeking literature, which was a post-cultural revolution movement. And then Haipai, Shanghai style. And if listeners want to know about Haipai, go listen to the Book of Shanghai episode, because my guest got into that one. Yeah, and then also Dusha, I guess urban matters or something, urban cosmopolitan literature. And that's maybe one link with Aileen Zhang Aileen, although what cosmopolitan means is maybe different for them. Been talking for a while, so I should take us onward. I had a section called Surface Level Questions, which had a characters, society, and a spicy question. Yes. I think we kind of talked about characters already. So if you're happy with that, I'll just skip that one.
Alrighty.
And then we got society. Like good comrades, we ought to consider class and the material situation of the characters. We kind of got into that already, but they're all shopkeepers. No one's especially rich, it seems, but no one is, as far as I could tell, no one's on the poverty line either. I'm going to say probably if anyone's got the most precarious situation, it's maybe the cobbler, because
that's what I was going to say.
Yeah, he gets displaced once or twice, and he is a migrant worker, essentially. He's doing what I've heard called circular migration, moving back and forward between the urban and the rural areas, even though ironically the rural area is still the Shanghai municipality.
Right. And he's the one that is often thinking about money. I don't feel like we get so much of the adding and subtracting, the calculating that we get with him with the other characters.
Yeah, and is it that he first gets to know Gundy because she's bringing him lunch, if I'm remembering right?
Well, her house is closest to him, and so he asked her at the suggestion of an older lady who's also she's the mother-in-law of Jinrong, because the cobbler was like, well, where can I heat up my lunch? I'll bring my lunch and I just need to heat it up. So Gundy becomes she opens her door for him to heat up his lunch, but they don't become friends that way, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah, it's a more economic relationship. I remember as well, you get sort of a sequel to that relationship when he finally takes her home for some sexy time, and she sees like the conditions he's living in. And what is it? He has a sink filled with cold water, and he says, when she's looking at it, raising an eyebrow, so to speak, he says, yeah, that's my fridge. That's how I keep stuff cold.
Right, yeah, true.
Because he doesn't have the facilities, which is just the same reason as why she's heating up food. He doesn't have the facilities to heat the food.
Right, he doesn't even own a shop per se. He just has a little corner stand, basically.
Yeah, it's kind of a Uber style model of doing business in a way.
In a way, yeah. And he's the only one who has to commute to work too. He walks, I don't know, what is it, 5 or 10 blocks to come to his work.
Yeah, and I kind of wonder if that compounds into or weaves into the age difference between him and the other characters. I read a book, was this last year? I think it was a year ago now. Time is so fast. It was called, what was it? Social Inequality. It was one of the Penguin imprint Puffin's like nonfiction books about social inequality in the modern world, but it was specifically in the UK. It was based on it. It was the authors of a UK study had written this book on what wealth and wealth differences look like in the UK. And although it was already, it was from about 2000 and was it? I think it was a pre-Brexit book, and then, pre-COVID, pre all these crazy changes. So already it's out of date. But one thing it underlined, which I had never really thought about before, is that one of the biggest differentiators, ways you can split the well off and the not so well off in the UK, is just age. Older people tend to be quite a lot better off just because they've accumulated this or that over time. So sure. I wonder if like the fact that the cobbler is, in a more precarious situation than the others, is it that he's on his way up and he'll be at their level in time, or is it something more fundamental that he's stuck one rung down the social ladder?
Right. Well, I mean, we do get maybe a hint at the very end when he makes his choice to become some sort of political go-between, and maybe that's his way of saying, well, it's not just money that's going to save me, it's the institution.
I'd forgotten what he did. Can you remind me?
I'd have to go and read the word, the actual name for it. Let me go through.
Sort of in short, though, he transitions out of working completely in the private sector to having some kind of tie with local government. Is that it?
Not quite.
It's terrible having these nuanced plots full of tiny little details.
Right.
And it was all just kung fu fights.
Even then. Uncle Ye asked Gunhai where he'd been the day before, and Gunhai told him that there had been a meeting for him and the other street side business people. They'd been called on to form a team responsible for keeping public order, and Gunhai was sporting a brand new red armband emblazoned with the words mutual defense. Right.
This is one of those, if you've lived in a big Chinese city, you'll probably have seen these very grassroots level sort of. Are they volunteers? Are they employees? Who knows? But when they get mobilized, they get mobilized.
This comes after his realization. So I think, speaking of plot, I think we do have to go back and talk about what happens in the lead up to this, because for the cobbler, it's actually very against his personality, maybe not so much principles, but it's definitely against his personality to become part of an organization as such, something so ceremonial in a sense, you know. He's not a free spirit by any means, but we see him as this person who
he's very self-sufficient, right?
Yeah, self-sufficient, definitely. And a bit of an independent thinker at the very least.
And
so
sorry to keep interrupting. I apologize, I keep interrupting. Okay. I just thought of a very good word. He seems like he's an autodidact as well, that he's self-taught as a reader.
Yes, absolutely. So this seems to be a bit of a shift for him, a lateral move. And it comes on the heels of the one time Gundi comes over to his house, or he doesn't live in a house, but she comes over to his place, which is in a bit of a rundown apartment building, as you've noted. And they run into his neighbors, who are also male migrant workers, and they're no stranger to bringing home women, and that's something that the cobbler had always looked down on them for doing, because they're all married, but their wives are all back in villages. And so in that he was bringing home a woman, they were kind of like, ha ha ha, yeah, so you're doing it, okay. And they were okay with that. They obviously had no problem with that, but he becomes very self-conscious and starts to feel like, well, that can't be a good thing for me, and I need to not have this happen. So essentially, he doesn't see Gundi for a while. He brings his daughters from the village into Shanghai for a visit. He kind of has this breakdown. He has this moment where he calls his wife and he breaks down crying on the phone. In classic Wang Anyi style, in this story, it's a paraphrasing. It doesn't become a very long conversation, but it's this really poignant moment where his voice cracks and he says, I miss you. And so the two daughters come to visit him, and in this span of 2 or 3 weeks, Gundi doesn't see him. So the next time she sees him, he doesn't really look at her in the eye, kind of ignores her, has this red armband on his sleeve, and has obviously joined this little team. And it's just this moment where you realize as the reader, wow, their relationship is done. And it comes very suddenly.
Yeah, he's going back to being sanctimonious.
Quite.
Yeah.
I didn't really understand the title until that moment. And then, yeah, had a bit of a reaction.
Okay, so it's our chance to be sanctimonious next, because the next question is, I'll just read it how I've written it. What version, or you could say vision, but I'll stick with version. What version of desire, romance, and sexuality has Wang Anyi inscribed here? Pardon the pretentious words. I have not very deep thoughts. I do have some thoughts, but what about you?
Maybe you could go first, because my first question is, I'm not quite sure what you meant by what version or even vision.
Right.
Okay. I didn't. Are there different types of desire, romance, and sexuality that I should be aware of before we answer the question?
There's an endless rainbow, I believe.
An endless rainbow. Okay.
If someone asked me the question, my answer would be that the first idea you get of people's desires and their romantic relationships with each other is very sort of just domestic or transactional. It's just about what men and women do for each other. And you see this in relationships where like Gundi and Xiaodi have this not very happy, but at least peaceful relationship where they have very clearly defined roles as to what they do. Mm-hmm. Xiaodi's role is not very impressive. Like he drives a taxi, he takes in some money, doesn't do any of the chores. Gundi, I believe she works and also does chores. Mm-hmm. So it's not.
She had worked, and then when we meet her, she's out of work.
Oh, right. Okay. So yeah. So they have, I guess, a traditional male and female domestic relationship.
But then that lovely moment where they kind of argue about it. It's like it's a fake argument. It's a conciliatory argument, but it's kind of a cute moment as well.
And then with the cobbler, you get the very, well, if you call it transactional, the economic reality of like he's left his family so that he can make money for the family. The classic one member of the family goes to the city and sends remittances back and is not necessarily going to be in the city forever. So that's basically a
I
completely.
think if I remember right, his wife is just a bit older than him.
Oh, right. I take your word for it.
Is a common thing, or it was a common thing in village circles, at least.
Oh, interesting.
So in that way, he's like painted as a bit traditional.
Okay.
I would say.
So he's very traditional. It's at least as we see, it's very economical. And then he has these non-romantic, non-sexual relationships with lots of other women in his life who are heating up his food, or they're his customers, and he has quite clearly drawn boundaries. And then as the story goes on, you get a sort of a slow, almost like frogs boiling, slow escalation into like first.
So funny that you mentioned frogs boiling, because one of my favorite scenes is when things start to heat up between him and Gandhi, and they both know what they want, but they haven't fully acted on it yet. He gets so worked up that he takes himself to a hot pot for dinner,
Yeah.
and he spends all this money on a one-person hot pot meal, and it's just so good. Like, it's let me find that part. He goes,
I'd forgotten about that.
finally,
it almost felt like we'd gone into a different story for a minute.
Yes, he just has this wonderful moment. So I'm going to read some of it, if that's okay. He goes, finally, he went into a Chongqing-style hot pot restaurant and ordered a super spicy hot pot made with chili peppers and numbing Sichuan peppercorns. There was enough broth to serve 4, but Gunhai had it all to himself. Spread before him was a platter heaped with marbled beef, lamb, pig's brain, and blood tofu. He plucked these delicacies up with his chopsticks, one morsel at a time, and submerged each one in the boiling broth, swirling it around before popping it into his mouth. It was piping hot, fiery and tingling, rich and pungent. And all of this, combined with the thought of how much it was costing, brought stinging tears to his eyes. He was just like some old fat cat, except that he didn't know how he was going to pay for it.
Have you ever seen the episode of The Simpsons where Homer gets Pinchy the lobster?
No.
He gets this pet lobster that he absolutely loves, and then someone like accidentally cooks it or something, and there's this scene where he's at the dinner table weeping, but also between weeps he's just eating this delicious lobster. It's kind of
it's basically like that.
similar
He
visuals.
says, it goes on, he says, his own children had never eaten a hamburger or gone to KFC. He felt sick at heart, but the worse he felt, the better the food tasted. Cheeks bulging with the oily and spicy food, he felt tears rolling down his face, and his frenzy gradually gave way to a sense of calm. I personally love that scene. It's described so well. I think Andrea Lingenfelter, the translator, just really captured a wonderful moment here. She used great adjectives and verbs. But also it's because it's this moment where they haven't, what's the word?
Consummated?
Yes, they haven't consummated their relationship. So the scene is very sexual as well. It's very sensual, and he's basically making up for what he wants to have happen in food.
But I would question how aware of that he is. Like, I know I name dropped Freud earlier, and I do think it's true that the more you push something down, the more it pops up somewhere else in a translated form, even if you don't recognize that's what's happened.
Oh yeah.
And I feel like the Sichuan food is perfect for that, because
absolutely,
it's a very Shanghai story. He's a Shanghai guy. Shanghai cuisine, or Zhejiang Jiangsu cuisine, is not that flashy. It's quite plain, a little bit sweet. But Sichuan food is this excessive explosion of sour, spicy, hot, although it can also be cold, oily, and hot, oily. Yeah, it's like the best Chinese food, I'm going to say right now. Yeah. It's certainly the most OTT, I think.
It's the line in that movie, The Sandlot, oiling and oiling. For the American listeners.
Yeah, so where was I going with? Yeah, so it's this thing that him as a character and also the story has sort of pushed down. Anything more than like a casual, not casual, anything more than a sort of teasing, chaste pinch has not appeared, and then you get this repressed and translated explosion in bodily enjoyment of food. Finally, it becomes about just your body experiencing something nice. And I kind of thought that was as OTT as we'd get. But there is a little brief section of the book. I won't do a reading because it might be a bit weird. But there's a little section of the book where we're getting into what it's like for the cobbler and for Gundy when they start having a sexual affair. They start banging in his apartment, and it's described just as excellently, I guess.
Oh yeah,
it's very
it's passionate, it's sensual, and there's also like these really lovely visuals that sounds like it's going to be graphic, but it's not. Like the first time she visits his place, he can't figure out, something's happened with his light or his lamp, and so he has to figure out where to plug it in or something, and he finally gets it turned on, and immediately you see their shadows cast on the wall, and so then everything is happening in Shadowland, right?
Mhm.
It's just lovely, like the way she delves into those feelings of that type of situation is great. Also, there are parts when we don't get Gunhai's thoughts about what it feels like to like touch Gundy, for example, not until later on, but we do get Gundy's reaction to even just like feeling his shoulder. And those reactions are so, like, if Wang Anyi delves into anything, that's what she really spends time doing, which I just think is great. There's a lot going around these days about the female gaze, for example, and I'm like, oh, she captured that one. She captured that in a multitude of scenes.
Yeah, there's bits. I mean, I was saying everything's repressed. That you could argue that the other way, because there's bits before that where like he's showing up and he's covered in sweat from a hard day's work, and she like washes him, and it's like, yeah, this is this is written by someone who's attracted to men, I guess,
Right.
or at least is able to put themselves in Gundy's shoes quite easily. I don't think I've got much more to say about this other than it's a really good. All of that stuff is described, like you said, very essentially, translated really nicely, and it has a little bit of the explicit, but never goes beyond the boundaries of good taste, because that if this story did that would be weird. The only point where it really does go into excess is the food, but that's very it's very amusing.
Yeah, it's very on brand, I would say. Like, and you were talking about whether the character himself would notice it. I think he would. I personally think he would, because I think that he is aware of his own. He's got a self-awareness that I think is missing in Uncle Ye, for example.
I was about to say Uncle Ye could have the exact same meal and not know why he's crying.
Exactly, right. And I think that the cobbler is so fastidious about the way he spends his time and the way he spends his money. I think at that point, he very well knew what was going on inside for him. And it is also a good thing to say it was not just a sexual relationship between them. They had become really good friends, and so that desire, to answer your original question, what version of desire, it's one of the highest versions of desire, because it was multi-layered attraction and connection. They were not just simply like, oh, this person is beautiful, I must have them. And they were not just, I'm bored at home and this person is available. It was none of that. It was simply, it was in fact against all of that. It was like, yes, this person is attractive, but I have a life and I'm married and, I'm doing this thing with my life and I have goals that I'm trying to reach. And, it was like with Gundy, for example, her life kind of goes through this change because how she had spent her time previously, suddenly she had this petty dispute with Jingrong, and it changed the way she was living her life totally in a lot of ways. And it made her realize that she, even after all those years, was still considered a bit of an outsider to that longtang, right? And so in many ways, she took a lot of comfort in the fact that Gunhai was also from the village and they could communicate on that level. So she felt like she had a friend. I would say it's one of the highest levels of desire and romance that can be written about.
Yeah, and on that point, if listeners are wondering who's Gunhai, That's a reveal.
That's the cobbler.
We
find out in this like
yeah.
really wonderful scene. It's exactly like a movie. It's exactly like a K-drama where you're just like, oh my God. He's like, by the way, you don't call me by my name. And she's like, what's your name? He's like, my name is the same character as yours. It's Gunhai. And she's like, Gunhai. So good.
Yeah, and to me that adds another dimension to the version of romance that we're dealing with, because it feels like they're soulmates, like they're destined together.
Yeah.
Or that, you know, not to make it sound incestuous, but like there's some, I don't know if family's the right word, but like,
maybe they're
you know,
twin flames. That's the big thing.
Sharing a name, there you go, where you are like reflections of each other.
Yeah.
Which can be a great thing for a relationship or a terrible thing, but it's undeniable that it's a powerful dimension when you have something like that.
Yes. And, you know, to their credit, they held off for quite a while. They really tried.
Yeah, commendable. I had another section here all about Wang Anyi. Actually, I'm realizing we had this conversation already. Like, I asked if this was a classic Wang Anyi story. We said it pretty much is. We had the question about the Newman Prize. We talked about that. But
related to what we were just talking about with novellas, extramarital affairs, or like really like deep romantic situations and feelings, that I have now come to realize is a big theme in novellas as a genre. If there is such a thing as a novella genre, the editors of this collection, they argue that is one of the themes of novellas.
Interesting. All novellas, or just in Chinese lit?
Well, that is something I wanted to talk about. So what they are pointing out is that novellas are not really a genre outside of China, at least not in Western literature. That in Western literature, there tends to be novels, long form, and short stories, short form. There's nothing really in between, which I have thoughts on that.
I disagree, but I think maybe I'm thinking of the form. I think the novel is a form in English. I don't think a novel is a genre, because when you pick up a novel, you don't go in English lit. You don't go in expecting anything except that it's going to be longer than a short story, shorter than a novel. And it might be a punchy, quick read, maybe. But like, as for genre, to me, a genre is about expectations that are sort of a deal between the writer and the reader. Like if your book has a sci-fi cover and there's no sci-fi in it, then I'll be like, well, you screwed the deal.
Yeah.
You tricked me. But with a novel, I have very little expectations except the size, but you can literally see how big it is when you pick it up. Right. So it's sort of a non-issue.
I feel like the editors, and an article I read about novellas in Chinese literature, I feel like that's exactly the point that they pass over. They don't really deal with the question of why they're calling it a genre in the first place. Yeah. And in fact, the author he basically discusses how it's very difficult to characterize the novella genre. And I think that you've characterized it quite well. If it's a genre, then there are expectations. And I got the feeling from the editors of this collection, when they talked about it in the introduction, that there is a set of expectations for Chinese readers when they approach something that is a 中篇小说. So it's not 短篇 and it's not 长篇, it's 中篇.
So help me here. 短篇is a novel.
No, 短篇 would be short story.
短篇 is a short story.
And then 长篇 would be the long, so novel.
Of course.
And then 中篇 would be middle length, basically.
Oh, right. Okay, easy to remember.
So whether there are expectations that a reader, especially a Chinese reader, would have towards a 中篇小说, I think could be delved into a lot more by the critics. And at least in the two pieces that I read, they don't really delve into that, but they sort of assume that it's there and by calling it a genre. I would agree. They deal a lot with the question of form, or at least length, saying that a novella in Chinese literature is somewhere over like short stories can be up to 20 or 30,000 words. So a novella would be over that, but under what a novel would typically be maybe approximately 130,000 words or more for a novel. So a novella has this huge middle ground between 30,000 and 130,000 words, which speaks to form. So you can imagine that that will probably be cut up into chapters like this Wang Anyi story is.
Right.
You know, Mo Yan's Hong Gao Liang, the Red Sorghum, for example, is characterized as a novella. But when it's published in English, it's a novel, right? And that's another thing that I think they could touch on, is the fact that, like, in Western literature, at least in the English-speaking world, a novel can be of any length, really. It can be long or short. It's different from short story, less in form and more in the lens that an author takes to the story, to the actual storytelling method. So I feel like so much of what gets published, or let's say so much of what gets translated from Chinese into English, are novellas, but they turn into novels when they're published in English.
Interesting. Yeah. Just trying to think of stuff I've read that from an English lit perspective would be a novella. Xu Zhichen's Running Through Beijing. I mean, that is either a very short novel or a novella from my English lit perspective. And then the Penguin shorts, so the one we did, Radish, in English lit standards, that's definitely a novella. I think that's
Sure.
like textbook.
I can see how that's a novella.
Yeah. But then there's other shortish novels I've read in translation from Chinese that I wonder now, would they be considered a novella? Like
I think of A Perfect Crime, because I could have sworn that I've
oh
heard
yeah,
say that it was a novella originally. I know it was published online originally, and then
right.
and then put in print. And now I'm just wondering, like, I'd have to go through the pieces that I've read to see if they characterize it as a novella or not.
It's definitely a very speedy read. I read a physical copy that looked sort of short novel size rather than a novella, but I think the type might have been quite large. And I definitely zipped through that really quickly.
No, it is. It's only 130 pages. It's
right.
really short. I'm pretty sure it's characterized as a novella. And also the fact that it was originally published online delves in, like, that has everything to do with the idea of serialization. If you're serializing things, like, and later turning a serialized piece of work into a printed work, that's when you run into different types of lengths, right? What these editors in this collection don't talk about is how in the early modern time, when people were putting out stories mostly, or like first and foremost, in newspapers, even they didn't know what it would turn into by the end, right? Some of them, like, for example, one of the first wuxia novels, for example, it was serialized for years. And so when you put it in print, it's humongous, right? It's huge. Of course, it's not going to be a novella, but when you're reading it in a newspaper, you're also not thinking of it as a novel at the time, or a novella for that matter. It's one installment after another, right? And that's a connection that has been brought to the 21st century with blogging, and putting things online first. People, scholars, critics have noted the fact that there is that similarity. Things aren't really printed, serialized in newspapers anymore, but they're serialized online now, and then sometimes turned into print, and in that way gain a bit more legitimacy sometimes. I think A Perfect Crime is a really good example of that. I don't know if this story would be I don't think this story would be a good example of that. I don't think that it was ever published outside of print form first.
Doesn't read that way. I was going to say, if older listeners might be about to throw away their phone in rage, but I have to say, out of the Chinese English language academic essays on Chinese lit I've read, I would not trust boomer academics to do a very good job analyzing Chinese web fiction. I've never seen it discussed, and it's such a huge deal among readers today in the 2020s, but also like way back to when millennials were tiny, like babies just starting high school. Like on this show quite early on, I covered Murong Xuecun, and listeners have told me, yeah, this guy like defined my reading habits when I was 13. online, and then later in print with like, you know, what's the word, bootleg copies and stuff.
Yeah.
And I've barely ever seen, not that I'm reading very much academic writing, but yeah, I feel like there could be the next generation of academics should definitely dig into that stuff. And the reason, by the way,
they're starting to.
Right, that's fantastic. I also wanted to bring up Murong because that hot pot scene absolutely reminded me of the main guy in Leave Me Alone, but also the other one of his that's translated, Running Through Red Dust, someone with a guilty conscience, just losing themselves in Sichuanese food. It's a vibe.
Well, there's one last part of that issue with novels, novellas, etc. I think going to mention him again, I'm pretty sure it was an interview or an article that I read by Howard Goldblatt, who was talking about how one of the favorite forms in China is the long novel, like the really ultra long novel, and that one of the challenges in bringing a novel like that into the English for English audiences, English speaking audiences, let's say, is oftentimes editors have to cut out a bunch of stuff because they can be superfluous to the story, they can be repetitious, all of these issues. But I think the fact that Goldblatt points out how much Chinese readers tend towards these long novels makes me think that it's not the novella that is kind of unique to China, it's the long novel that's more of the unique thing, and that the novella is more just a novel. You know what I mean?
I do.
So I just wonder if the editors of this collection perhaps, like, I feel like they could have clarified these points a little bit.
Yeah, it's tricky when you're dealing with two languages where the words appear to mean the same thing, but actually they're maybe not as aligned as they are. I'll take us to our next section. Again, we've already talked about a lot of this. It's about Shanghai, the ever-present character in the story, the city itself. So we can take this question wherever it might lead us, but I was going to ask you, what species of Shanghai story is this? And is it in fact a Jiangsu story by other means? Like, is this really an urban story, or is this just a story of rural people who are in the city?
That's such an interesting question. I don't know if I'm the best person to ask about this, because I feel like you know more about Shanghai literature than I do. I personally love to introduce my students to literature. Well, I introduce them to a lot of literature that is set in Shanghai, and then of course I bring up the idea that there is something called the Haipai, and you know, there is that the urban setting is unique within the context of like native place literature. That's what I tend to think of when I'm talking about Shanghai literature. But when you say which species of it, I don't know if I know a lot of different species, so I feel like you could teach me.
Okay, what I'll do is I'll use my other Zoom account to log in, join this meeting, and then when I'm editing it, I'll shift the pitch of that voice up or down a level, and then we'll have two Anguses. We'll have a Beijing Angus who'll be a little bit deeper, and then the Shanghai Angus who's a bit more feminine, maybe.
Who enunciates his R's.
Yeah. Angus will be like Wang Anyi, and then Shanghai Angus will be like, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
I think the things about the story that seem Shanghai-esque to me that I can remember off the top of my head are, again, the Xiaodi character. He almost seems like a caricature of this wimpy Shanghai man, which I heard about. I only ever met one really gentle local Shanghai lad, and he was a very sweet mama's boy, but he wasn't stupid at all. He was very smart. But I guess also that caricature also sort of points to the way Shanghai is thought of as a more wealthy, westernized, less earthy sort of place.
Right.
Which is, I don't know, you kind of see that in the story and you kind of don't. All the characters are pretty civilized. none of the men are really brutish, apart from the guys from Hunan. They are like brutes. I say that with love, of course.
Yes.
And there is one man-on-man fight in the story.
Oh yeah, that's a great scene too.
Yeah, I guess the fight feels kind of Shanghai-esque to me, because in small town China, I think I sometimes saw bickering, but it was only in Shanghai I saw people really going at it.
Oh,
And it was always like, local people, probably from the alleyway, presumably yelling over something domestic.
that's
So
quite
there's that. But then I have that's the only really big Chinese city I've lived in. So I have trouble separating what is specifically Shanghainese from what is just, a tier 1 or a tier 2 Chinese city daily
sure.
life. The other thing is maybe the fashionable ladies, the Shanghai Dama in their modern attire, and then the other Shanghai Dama in her, I don't know if it's more modern or more traditional or more different version of femininity, but the way that both those characters have found a way to present themselves very specifically and take pride in it and project a certain air about themselves. One is very effusive and the other is very always maintaining face. That feels kind of Shanghai to me. That feels like ladies I might have walked past on the way to Family Mart, or the fact that Gandhi goes dancing in one of the squares. I mean, I know that is a China-wide thing, the IE square dancing, but I believe that in Shanghai, the dancing grannies are known for going a bit extra. Some of the ones I would walk by, they look just like the dancing middle-aged women in the small town I lived in. But if you went by the right one, it looked like they'd gone for an evening on the ballroom or whatever. They felt like they were the heir to the sort of Republic of China tradition of the ballroom gatherings. Beyond that, like I know the longtangs that the story is set in are either they're a kind of shukuman, or shukuman is a kind of that alleyway. And I know that sort of specific alleyway shukuman culture is a side of Shanghai when exploring. I walked down some of the more famous ones. But like, to be honest, as a privileged teacher at an international school in Shanghai, this stuff wasn't my life. This was like the thing I would see out the corner of my eye and then keep on walking.
There was one time, even me, I never lived in Shanghai, but even within or even among most of my visits, I really only went to a longtang area once. It was on one of my first visits there. I was told there was a market where you could buy silk stuff. It's exactly what I would imagine this story. It was very different from like the French concession area where the roads are narrow, but they're not super narrow. This was a lot of buildings, and in between the buildings were actual alleyways, and there were lots of like clothes hanging out of windows that were very close together. Wasn't a lot of sun that was able to hit a lot of that laundry really, because it was all just so close together. But what was so interesting was that it was a very industrial feeling area as well, because it was just outside of all these factories. And then you could take a ferry. That's what I ended up doing. I took a ferry over to the Puxi side and went to the big mall there. So it was just like worlds apart in terms of material items. Couldn't be more different. But that's sort of what I imagined as the realistic setting of this. To your question about what characterizes this as a Shanghai story, I kind of see it in terms of space. When I imagine the longtang, or as I'm reading Wang Anyi's descriptions of the setting, I get a real sense of closeness. You have, if you're in an alleyway, you have your width, and that's obviously going to be much smaller than your length. And I kind of liken that to the emotional alleyways of the characters. Like there's a certain length that that can happen in their emotional contact with each other and with in their circumstances, but the width sort of counters that in a way. So in some ways, it's like there's only one direction for the emotion to go. It doesn't expand as such. It can only move forwards or backwards. And in many ways, like that's what we see in the story. Jinrong, her character, I think, is a good example of it, because we come to find out that she is she's cold on the outside, but she's this like burning hot ball of passion on the inside. And she's tired of just like being ignored by her husband. So she's actually on the lookout for somebody. But because she's cold on the outside, she doesn't really know how to make that happen. And she kind of finds the perfect victim in Uncle Ye, except that he's not the sharpest tool. And so like she has to give him this major hint, but then he kind of botches it. So you can see how her emotion like goes straight forward, but then it has to just like come crashing to a stop, right? As if like the force of it and the buildings just somehow collide. So it's like she can't exit where that emotion is happening.
It's hard for anyone to get distance from what's immediately happening to them.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's her story is so interesting too, because she ends up becoming better friends with his Uncle Ye's wife than Uncle Ye himself, which is what she was trying to go for.
Right. I think I have nothing else particularly insightful I can say about like what makes it a Shanghai story or what type of Shanghai story it is, except by going to the thing I was going to ask you next about what people who've never been to China or Shanghai might be missing. Because I would say for Shanghai, the thing that a reader who doesn't have the context won't get from the words themselves is that, you know, not far away from where the story is happening, there could be massive 30-story buildings or some of the richest people in the world going about their days, because we're so zoomed into this particular neighborhood, and you know it feels like it could be happening in a much smaller town, but the reader who knows Shanghai will know that this is just one little slice of life in a place with 20 million lives or something crazy like that. And probably the other thing is, for someone who doesn't know about anything about China, that I'd underline is when he goes to get that Chongqing food, that's a very specific type of Chinese food, which is mega different from what a guy from the north of Shanghai would be used to. And also that because he's from a lower rung of society, the price of that food would clean him out. Whereas, at least in my experience, if you're on a higher salary in China, that food will be like pennies to you, nothing. But I think it's significant that it cleans him out, where it's just a hot pot meal. I
would agree with that. And I think this question and the kind of approach you're taking to it is very much in the realism vein of things, with the idea that perhaps the actual setting sort of influences the way that the story either plays out or the style in which it's written. Speaking on style, the other reason that I find it hard to answer the question is because I'm a bit more familiar with like my research in the Dongbei region, right? So literature from the 30s and 40s that are supposedly representative of this cold, harsh environment. And that's what a lot of critics have looked at those stories as representing. Like, they have cold and harsh characters. There's a really difficult environment that they have to overcome. So that relationship between person or individual, or more like collective, against nature and or against the big scary threat, typically of the Japanese at that time, it was sort of compounded by the fact that you are surrounded by snow and ice and cold wind that might like make you lose a finger or a toe, right? And I feel like what happens in those stories is the sophistication in the style sort of it's not so sophisticated in that sense. I feel like if I'm looking for a Shanghai story, so to speak, I'm looking for that sophistication. I'm looking for a meandering narrative style. I'm looking for characters who are slightly aloof to the world around them, but also very much embedded in their local drama. I'm looking for a softness in the way that people speak to each other, but there's a characterization in this story where they talk about how, like, when something dramatic happens between two people, if they have a problem with each other, there's no way for them to air it, so they have to keep it inside, because kind of like with what I was saying with the alleyways, it's just too narrow to let your grievances really be aired. Whereas like Dongbei literature is all about airing grievances, because that's what there is there. There's just this space for you to do it in, and the problem is that no one's listening. But in Shanghai, you have ears in the walls. And so whatever you say is going to be turned into rumors about you, right? So I feel like that's a part of the style as well. It comes through in the style, it comes through in the plot, and in the relationships between the characters. I think Wang Anyi's narrative style, that meandering, she does very, very well. It very much feels like maybe you're placed on you have a bit of a bird's eye view, and then that bird comes wandering through the alleyways and you're seeing people's lives play out. That's how I sort of envisioned it. It's very visual. There's a very visual element to it as well.
Yeah, you've articulated something I was failing to articulate, probably because it's in Shanghai. It has this easy breezy feeling, and it has a level of sophistication. I guess it's something I was trying to say earlier, in the difference between Jinrong and Shanghai, is that the way class distinctions work so often around the world is that as people become more well off, they become more attached to a feeling of sophistication, because what do they say? Having cultural capital helps justify your actual capital that you own. And part of that way of behaving as if you're higher class, he says, doing the bunny ears quotes thing with his fingers, is that you're less direct. Everything is more indirect. And that all the drama, until it blows up, so much of the drama in the story is indirect. And the things that the characters have grievances over are, in the grand scheme of things, quite small and petty for the most part. And I guess that makes it a Shanghai story. And I think it's interesting that even though none of the characters are actually that materially wealthy, the Shanghai vibe is there, in that they are a little bit more sophisticated.
There is a richness in their personalities and the way they express themselves, for sure.
Yeah, and they're a lot more insulated from, say, death by starvation than the people of Dongbei in the 30s. But they're still not that well off. So it's that subtle difference that I guess is there in the story that helps make it a piece of Shanghai writing.
Yeah, I would hope that Wang Anyi would agree with something like that.
Yeah, I'm sure she's probably talked about that in Fudan University or something along those lines. Last question I got here for you. Is this your favorite, or do you have a favorite depiction of Shanghai in fiction?
I don't know if I have a favorite depiction. I actually just really like that we get so many types of depictions, right? There is, I will say, a story that I recently taught in one of my classes was, oh my gosh, what is the author's name? I always find his name really difficult to say. TrChFic.
That's funny. I was about to guess that.
Really?
Yeah.
I don't know if I believe you, but anyway, TrChFic's
You just have to take it on faith.
One rainy spring evening. Oh my gosh, titles are just gone. But it was written in 1929, so this is quite an old story. But it's basically this man who gets he stays late at work, and then after work he goes wandering through the rainy streets, because it's during the the plum rain.
Plum rains, yeah.
So he goes wandering around, he has his umbrella. And what I like about that story is actually the critical analysis that my former supervisor gave of it, because she calls that character a flaneur, basically a street wanderer, someone who's purposely wandering the street. It's an archetype in modernist literature, someone who is in an urban setting, wandering the streets, taking it all in, acting as this sort of like a detached observer, but really taking a lot of pleasure in it. And in that way, it becomes very sensual. So I really like that depiction. I think in many ways, when I think of Shanghai literature, that image comes to mind. It lends itself, the city itself lends itself to the idea of a street wanderer, a flaneur. When I taught this a few weeks ago, by the very end, it just occurred to me, like, Malta actually really doesn't lend itself to being a flaneur. And the reason why I said that was because I think in my past life, meaning that when I lived in China all those years ago, that's something I enjoyed doing. And in a place like Shanghai, it's very easy to do. Just like how I was in Pudong, in that silk market area, wandering those longtangs, and then got on a ferry and found myself in Puxi, ended up getting on the metro going back to Pudong, but in a different area. You know what I mean? You end up covering all this ground, and the entire time you're sort of walking or taking public transportation, you're observing so many things. Malta's not really like that, and I miss being that flaneur. So yeah, when I think of Shanghai, I do think of that.
Yeah, I absolutely miss that about Shanghai too. I only, strictly speaking, did this a few times, but a few times just for I had a spare day, I would just pick a subway station, go there, walk about, see what I find. Although often it would be a little bit more targeted than that. But yeah, you're right. The excellent public transport system of modern Shanghai just multiplies what is already an amazing place to just wander aimlessly. And you can do that because of all the interesting things going on there, for sure.
Can I say one more thing about the story? Yeah. Which is sort of unrelated to the Shanghai bit, but I think it can be related potentially. After I read the story and I was thinking about what I wanted to talk about, the idea of personal fulfillment came to mind. I think that the story in a big way is about personal fulfillment, but the fact that none of the characters end up being personally fulfilled, I think is interesting. And I was asking myself, how would you explain that? Why do you think that's the case? And I said, because what's the use of personal fulfillment if you can't live in peace with your neighbor? I kind of feel like that sort of sums up the story. So in a big way, it's about self-preservation, and that self becoming very, very much well, I guess what's interesting about this story is that self is not Wang Anyi, and that self does not come through with any one character. It perhaps comes through most with the city as itself.
Yeah, cities reproduce themselves,
right,
through their people. That's true.
And so the peace is maintained.
Yes. And by the way, the name of that Shud Josun story, at least translated in English, is One Evening in the Rainy Season, or One Evening in the Spring Rains. So something like that.
There are 3 stories that have, not all by Shud Josun, but all written in that same era, that have a very similar title, and someone who's getting them mixed up.
Right. Yeah, that's just not fair when that happens. I will rattle off what my favorite Shanghai in fiction that I've come across so far is. Two of the close runners-up were actually in the mega crossover part 2 episode I did. One was Shanghai Foxtrot by Mu Shiying, another modernist Shanghai guy, and then there was Sealed Off by Alien Chang that I mentioned. But I'm going to give the prize to a novel, or maybe it's a novella, a Zhong Pian. What's it called? Cai Jun's. The English translation in its publication is called The Child's Past Life. The book's title in Chinese is so much better. It's Sheng Se He, like life, death, river, i.e. it should have been called in English The River of Life and Death, because that's 10 times cooler and that's a better description of what the plot is. It's about a guy who was murdered. He's a teacher in a school. He lives on a school campus. He gets murdered. We don't know why, but then he's reincarnated in a little boy, sort of the Omen style, creepy little boy who's too worldly for his years. and we follow him, and the sort of the mystery is solved, and revenge is, well, perhaps revenge is had. And it's set around, bloody hell, what's it called? Suzhou Creek, Suzhou He, which is this little sort of small river that runs through Shanghai and marks an important boundary. And that was one of my favorite spots in Shanghai. Cai Jun, the author, has a short story in the book of Shanghai just called Suzhou He, which is another time warping, haunting depiction of the creek, Suzhou He. And yeah, it just felt like it helps that I lived on a school campus as well when I lived in Shanghai. I never didn't get murdered, was not reincarnated, but just the vibe. As far as I know, yeah. It was the novel was very plot and character driven, but like the little snippets of like the setting were really nice as a way to be there without being there, Wang Anyi style.
It's interesting that you mentioned the rivers, because the editors of this collection also point out that that's one thread that ties all 7 stories together, is they all feature a river. Although I don't really remember what the river I don't really remember the river in this particular story.
Yes, I'm calling bullshit on that, at least for this story. There's no river.
Fair enough. But Wang Anyi herself in her acceptance speech for the Newman Prize says, consciously or unconsciously, we are always nudged along by such currents, and they are a good thing, moving us along with the stream, or else propelling us forward against it. These forces push you out onto the road, and once you are on your way, you can go anywhere.
All right. There, that works. That works for by the river anyway. It's definitely true. Shanghai is a river city, but there's no river in Sanctimonious Cobbler. And I guess rivers are a thing in lots of cities, but a country like China where canals are so important as well, that's got to be a thing. I'd love to talk more about bodies of water in Chinese cities, but I'll take us to the miscellaneous section instead. First miscellaneous question for you. Is there a Chinese word of the day you'd suggest for the Sanctimonious Cobbler?
Well, I think I'm going to go with what we discussed before, 中篇小说.
Right. This is one I will not have to ask the characters for, although I'm going to have to rely on auto keyboard giving me the right pian. Magic. Okay, so I guess we don't really need to explain that one very much.
The novelette. I really want to know what in the world is a novelette.
I know that at least the translation of Beijing, Folding Beijing, Beijing Jidia by Hao Jingfang is referred to by Ken Liu, the translator, and I think the original publisher and translation, Uncanny Magazine, they call it a novelette. And I think that's because it is basically like either a very long short story or a very short novella. So it sits, at least in the English world, would be landing somewhere between novella and short story. Right.
See, I think our discussion really has prompted me to think of this as like beyond length, beyond form. It's either a genre or it's not. And if it's not, then we should just stop using that word and basically consider it one of those translations that just doesn't work. You know what I mean?
Yeah, my feeling, I don't really know so much about the translations because my Chinese is pretty limited, but my feeling is if an academic is talking about a format of media as if it's a genre, then I think they don't understand either what a format or a genre is. Maybe that's not so true for something mega specific like, say, a haiku or a sonnet. But like, to my mind, anything can go inside the placeholder box of a novel or a novella. Like, if I'm going to be really sanctimonious here, I would say someone who thinks that a novella is a genre probably is a snob who doesn't read genre fiction, who understands the full rainbow spectrum of categories of amazing, entertaining genre fiction you can get in literature. And possibly they are too stuck in thinking of literature as a form of like education or cultural worthiness rather than entertainment, because genres are written to entertain readers, and I think a lot of academics basically are badly disconnected from that. That's my hot take.
It's a great hot take. I think it's a worthy one to be aware of, especially when we're talking about like 21st century Chinese literature in particular.
Yeah. I also kind of, maybe you might have an inside perspective on this, but I find it interesting for academics like the people who work on CLT. They do have to sort of juggle two things. They have to be sinologists, or three things even: sinologists, language experts, and they need to do like literary criticism as well.
Yeah.
And I wonder if some, different people have their levels stacked out in different ways, where some of them are excellent sinologists, but they basically don't know how to talk about literature properly, whereas maybe some have ropey language skills, but like me, are pretty comfortable talking about literature as literature. I don't know what you think about that.
This is a historical problem because it boils down to the issue of area studies. Like Chinese studies falls under Asian studies largely, or they're both kind of considered as separate parts of cultural studies. And then area studies is then like the umbrella that they fall under. I don't know. It's really difficult to categorize them because the problem is the categorization itself. Like, why do we need to categorize these things? And that all goes back to the colonial era of how these, disciplines got started in the first place.
Yeah.
So these are language issues. These are thinking issues, as in like theoretical issues. But what happens is that you do have people. I'm very similar to you. I originally started in English literature. I was more on the literary side of things and learning what theory meant, or literary criticism in that vein. And then you come over to Chinese literature, and there's such a heavy bend towards historical analysis and putting history on top of literature, and like the framework of studying a piece of work mainly through a historical or a socio-historical lens. That's the biggest option, right? To the point that psychological studies or comparative approaches that don't really take history into account too much, they get lost in it. It's a problem in the field, I would say. And I will only say that I think in the 21st century, now that we're seeing so much different type of literature, and as you pointed out, lots of different genres, apart from like the so-called highbrow critical type of literature, now that we're just seeing a huge diversity of literature, we can, I think, take a lot of different approaches to it. The problem becomes the people who are mostly doing a lot of that critical effort, they're still in the institutions of the universities, and in that institution you belong to certain departments that are named after this bygone era, and there's just, it's not a limitation per se, but it definitely weighs on your mind, because what we do is interdisciplinary by nature. It has to be if you're dealing with the socio-historical context of a book, there's a lot to take into account. And then the other side of that, I know I've gone on too long already on this topic, but it is a big one in the field. The other side of it is literary theory or literary criticism in general, and applying it to literatures outside of the Anglo-Saxon tradition. You also run into the problem of like how to do that, who are you drawing from? And then on top of that, with Chinese literature, you have like David, what's his name? David Derwei Wang, for example. I like how he characterizes things, because he breaks it down and says there is literary theory, but then there is Chinese literary history. And in a big way, or Chinese literary thought, I should say, Chinese literary thought. And I like that distinction, because I think for people like you and me who are coming from the literary side of things, that's where we can go, oh, okay. So it's more about discourse, it's more about the social effect, it's more about the intellectual history, and because of that, the history itself, rather than what happened in the 1960s in Europe and the US, where you start to get these more psychological theories happening as a result of like post-war thoughts and post-war criticism and, you know, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a really different tradition. And I think it's important to recognize that especially if we are going to do scholarly work on it.
I'd love to, again, do an episode on all of this. I'll just try and close it off with an anecdote, something recent. I was talking to my girlfriend who came out of a PhD on Anglo-Saxon lit. She was doing wolves in Anglo-Saxon literature. And we were talking about like her reading and how she noticed sometimes she would be citing an academic who's got a, you know, European name of some sort, but they're working in a Chinese university in the English department there. And I was like, yeah, that's not so unusual. English departments are everywhere. In China, they'll employ foreigners as well as having local employees. And then she said, yeah, and sometimes there'll be just like Chinese academics at like, say, Tsinghua or Peking, and they are writing about Anglo-Saxon lit, and there might even be like a Anglo-Saxon studies department at, say, Beijing University, or Peking University rather. And at first I was like, isn't that peculiar? And then I stopped and thought, no, why should that be peculiar? If you're going to do Chinese studies taught by a bunch of Anglo or Scottish or German people in Europe, then why the hell should it be bizarre to be doing Anglo-Saxon studies in Tokyo or Chongqing with local people there? It's perfectly justifiable so long as they're serious academics with access to the resources they need to do their studies.
Of course, definitely.
And if any Anglo-Saxon experts of Beijing are listening, please get in touch.
Sorry, we're not calling it English literature. But actually, like here in Malta, so one of the things that's coming up for me is I don't think this is really a plug because it's like basically already set in stone. But there's gonna be a conference. It's our first Chinese studies conference that's going to be held here. And the idea behind it was, hey, what does it mean to do Chinese studies outside of a place like China or outside of even a place like the UK or the US, where traditionally a lot of sinologists have been based, right?
Yeah.
What does
Malta never set up a concession in Shanghai.
Right. No, I mean, they were a colonial outpost of Britain, so how could they? So what does it mean to do Chinese studies here, right? There's I think some interesting theoretical questions, and I'm interested in what will happen at the conference, because we're going to have hopefully people from like Italy and Poland, you know, kind of contributing to this conversation. So I think the field is changing, but it's a little hard to see it, I think, if you're based in a, let's say, British or an American university, or even Chinese university, to be honest.
Totally. Yeah, I've had, how many? I think three different times on the show I've had someone with an Eastern European like nationality or at least cultural background. Even that's an interesting perspective to get on Chinese lit. It's, you know, has a post-communist thing, and it also just is not Anglo. Or it's, you know, Anglo influenced but also separate from it. So that's interesting. Anyway, I know I keep saying this, we could go on and go on and go on. It's fascinating, but I have to take us to another silly question, and that's the piece of music you pair with the story. So let's say we're making I feel like this wouldn't be a feature film. This might be like a sort of made for TV 1 hour affair, perhaps.
You know, it reminds me of something I've watched before, but I haven't been able to pin down the thing in my head. So that's why I had up till now.
Yeah, if we're making the telemovie for this drama, what piece of music would you pick for the soundtrack?
So it's not so much a particular song. I struggled with this question, to be honest.
This is a hard one.
Yeah.
It's real homework.
It really was. But I happened across a video about a J-pop band that, well, the video I came across was this guy saying they're going to go big. They're going to go big. We'll see. I don't know. But they're called Yoasobi. And it's kind of a duet group. It's a guy and a girl.
そばで生きると決めたその日から少しずつ変わり始めた世界強くあるように弱さを
So what's interesting about them is that they make music based off of novels. So I think for that purpose alone, this would be a good novel, novella, whatever, to turn into a piece of music. And then I was listening to some of their music today, and a couple of them had, like, there's one called Monster. I don't know how it's pronounced in Japanese, but in Chinese it would be Guai Wu. That's what you could search it under in YouTube. But I felt like those lyrics were reminding me of the Cobbler, which was kind of cool. And then there was a different song called The First Tape, which I felt could be Gandhi's perspective on things. So I felt like there was both of those there. And then just by sound, I think, well, sound-wise, I feel like their music fits more into like an anime style, like what you would hear in anime. But that being said, these kind of zoomy, overlooking, bird's eye view perspectives, I think are reminiscent of that one, what is it? Kiki's Delivery Service or that.
Oh, yeah.
So it's a little bit, I feel like it could work. I feel like with this music could work for this story.
My choice is, I'm afraid it's Anglo, terrible. It's a
Japanese,
song.
it's even worse.
Oh yeah, let me just load up my rifle quickly. Get the barbed wire ready. Yeah, so the song I've picked is by a band called Clever Girl, as in like a reference to Jurassic Park, I believe, when they're talking about the raptors. And the track is all lowercase apart from the first letter, no spaces. Oh my God, I love you, please don't leave me. And
yeah, I could see how that fits.
Yeah. Because I was trying to find a band that play in a style called like math rock or post rock, which is usually kind of good, standard rock band lineup. Although I think these guys have like a flute or a saxophone or something as well. There's some more gentle instruments in there. Anyone who's heard a math rock band before will know what the kind of sound is, but if you haven't, it's sort of not many guitar chords, lots of individual notes played in a very technical sort of manner, so jumping from note to note, maybe with odd time signatures, but technical what am I trying to say, technical notes aside, the tone tends to be sort of gentle, calm, playful, not intense music at all. It's like a contrast of very intense, I guess, fretwork, what do they call it, finger work, hard to play, but very gentle and peaceful to listen to, very intricate. Often they don't have conventional song structures. So it goes from like, movement A, B, and C rather than verse, chorus. And I just thought that gives you some of the mood of the story, where it's not very much tension. The drama is rarely anything very stressful, but it might really make you feel something like it did for you. I'll confess it didn't really do that for me, but it did sort of have me daydreaming along, and this track by Clever Girl is quite daydreamy, so that's why I picked it.
I don't know if it's a good thing that it evoked an emotion.
I think that is a good thing if a story has a visceral effect on you as a living animal, that it's not just interacting with your mind, but it can make you breathe faster or cry or blush. Then that's a powerful piece of art, I think.
Yeah, I think it did all three of those.
Excellent. That's a hat trick for Wang Anyi. All right. For our further reading questions, if listeners want more, I've said if listeners want more like this book, obviously, we could do this two ways. We could say if listeners want more like the Sanctimonious Cobbler, where would you direct them? or if they just want more like by the river, where would you send them?
To be honest, I did not prepare for this question, so I don't really know. I mean,
It's
obviously,
okay.
other Wang Anyi stories come to mind because I feel like that's just obvious.
I would say the Book of Shanghai is quite a good go-to because you'll get
Okay.
lots of different stories set in Shanghai, all different styles. Some are a slice of life, some there is something a bit more heightened or exciting going on, but all of them give you a flavor of Shanghai, and a fair number of them, it's this sort of on the street level, working class and or ordinary person sort of perspective, small things of daily life. Not all of them are like that, but yeah, that's definitely there in Book of Shanghai. But yeah, otherwise, I can't think of anything mega specific, again, because this isn't always what I look for in my reading, but maybe also because possibly this is a little different from what often gets translated to English from Chinese, because it's just a slice of life. It's not about anything of great note that a translator or a publisher might latch onto.
That's true. Yeah, to imagine it as a standalone piece would be rather tricky, definitely. In that we're talking about bodies of water. I didn't read this book recently, but a couple of years ago I read The Hungry Tide, which is a novel by Amitav Ghosh, and it's set in Bangladesh. He's Bangladeshi. That's a great novel. Great story. Also has a really good love story at its core, but it's not like your typical romance. It's one of those where two people from very different walks of life, kind of similar to this in some ways. Well, they're not really from different walks of life, but they're embedded in very different lives, right? And that's what happens in The Hungry Tide as well. They have an experience together that definitely has love, desire, romance at its core, but the story itself is not about that. So in that sense, it has this really emotional, like the waves that come mimic the water. It's very emotional in that way.
And it's called The Hungry Tide.
Yes.
Okay,
it's
cool.
A very good book, written beautifully.
Yeah, now I'm trying to think of anything not Chinese I've read reminds me of this story. I think, again, though, I just don't read an awful lot of stories like this, so I can't think of anything that leaps to the forefront of my mind as being similar. Another book to name drop, it's the one you're reading right now. What are you reading just now?
The book that I'm reading right now is called The Dictionary of Lost Words.
Ooh. Is that a fiction or a non-fiction?
It's fiction. It's historical fiction. It's basically about it. It's a story, a fictional retelling of how the first edition of the Oxford English Dictionary came to be. And it's because it's a fictional retelling, it centers on a girl, basically the daughter of one of the compilers, and she kind of gets caught up in the trade as well. But because she's a girl, the idea is that there are these words that she comes across that don't always get included in the dictionary. So I'm only halfway through, but basically it's her keeping a record of these words, these domestic or women's words, right?
But if we weren't supposed to be getting near the end of the conversation, I would take us down a rabbit hole of saying that's something we didn't talk about for this story by Wang Anyi, is whether it's women's feminine domestic writing, because I think I saw on her Wikipedia page there's been discussion as to whether that's what she writes, sort of women's perspective. Is it feminist because it's more domestic, blah, blah,
There's
blah.
a whole conversation there, definitely.
Yeah, next time maybe. I'll say what I'm reading as well. I'm reading, it's impossible to connect with this really, other than that it's short form writing and it's in a collection. It's Casting the Runes by M.R. James. So it's like weird ghost stories by a posh English man. Not much to say really, other than they're pretty good.
They sound good. I feel like the last time we
repetitive.
talked, you were also reading ghost stories.
Yeah, it might have been different ghost stories. This is my first time reading M.R. James, but yeah, it's the same phase in my life as a reader.
Sure.
It's just a phase that's been going on a while.
Yeah, this is part of a new phase, not really a new, kind of a return phase for me as well, because right before I read this book, I read Girl with a Pearl Earring, or I should say reread, because I had read that in high school. So I guess and this book follows kind of a teenage girl. And so in some way it's like, I don't know why I'm past that age, but I am revisiting these ideas.
Mm-hmm. I've realized as I get older, there's more and more stuff to revisit, and the gap in time between then and now becomes longer. So all the more reason to revisit them, see them with new eyes.
Definitely. And I think that especially for like Girl with the Pearl Earring, that was a really interesting one to revisit, because at the time I read that as like this wow kind of romance, and now reading it, I'm like, okay, yes, been there, done that. Not the most exciting thing. I'd much rather read a Wang Anyi novel than that type of, although they're similar in some ways. I mean, I'm not going to go into it. They're similar in some ways, but there's a really different perspective when you're dealing with middle-aged characters compared to teenage characters. And the girl who wrote Girl with a Pearl Earring was a teenager when she wrote it. Gosh. Although she wrote it in a very sophisticated way, it's very good, but still it does come from someone who hadn't had those life experiences yet. And I think there's a real difference in terms of depth that Wang Anyi is able to reach because of that. Because
she's been on the planet for a reasonable number of decades by this point.
She's been a woman on this planet for a number of decades. She knows how to, hit those points.
Speaking of hitting points, is there anything we've not touched on yet that you'd like to mention about this story or about anything else?
Not off the top of my head.
Yeah, no doubt after I hit stop, though, something will. Yeah,
probably. I think the conversation has gone really well, and I've really enjoyed it. It's always nice to talk to you and talk about books and writing and Chinese literature. So
yeah, and it's nice to have a returnee guest. I'm thinking of at least temporarily wrapping the show up at episode 100, and this is 82.
Really?
So it's so doing the maths, I'm not going to bring back every guest as a returnee unless I cram them all in together. So
I was going to ask you about that. At this stage, I was going to ask you,
where does it end?
Either off or on the show, but like, what's the plan for the podcast now?
Yeah, I don't think I talked about this on into the microphone. When I'm going to do some kind of I don't know if I'm going to do it from like episode 90 to 100 or 95 to 100 or just the last one. I'm going to go out with some kind of a bang or special format, and then keep the feed up live, but go do other stuff. Get my driver's license, maybe get some HSK Chinese qualifications as well. That might be more viable than driver's license because cars are expensive. We'll see about that. One or the other or both, and then I suspect I'll come crawling back to for the next 100 episodes.
Okay.
I'm going to try and write some fiction as well. So lots of side projects, and then maybe get some more translated Chinese lit under my belt so that I have a great big buffer, so that when when I come back to the show, I don't have to be constantly reading more stuff as raw material for the show, if you see what I mean.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
The other
you
thing
mean like digging deeper into things that you've already read?
No, I just mean literally reading books and short stories so they can be topics for the show.
Oh, got it. Like getting a reservoir. I get it.
Yeah. Although actually the other thing I've thought of doing, this far in the future when I've made it past 100 and then come back is maybe only doing short stories so that I don't have to, half the novels I read have to be translated from Chinese. Sure. And also I'm thinking I might try and make it a 2-person show, so have a co-host so that I don't have to bring a guest on every single time.
Sure.
Because that slows me down a lot. Like, it's unless you're a real genius or do it full time, having a guest on every single episode and doing it regularly is that's a nightmare. So that might be another thing I do, but I'd have to find someone who's game for that.
Right.
So thank you for coming on the show, Lehyla.
Thank you. It's been great.
All right, we've reached the end of the episode. All that remains really is the plugs. So follow us on Instagram at TrChFic, TrChFic. Also follow me on Twitter at Angus Likes Words. There's a Discord you can join. There's a link for that in the show notes. If you'd like to support the show, we have a Patreon and also various other ways you can support the show. But the Patreon is maybe the best because $1 a month and up gets you access to all the bonus shows I put out. We've got donkeys worth of those. Loads and loads and loads. Of course, the very best thing you can do for the show is to spread the word. Tell your friends, tell your teachers, tell your lecturer at Fudan University, and most importantly, tell your neighbour that you're spying on and or considering starting an affair with. And on that underhand note, I will say 再见。
今天就像一封写好了信，等着贴上一枚新邮票。